You worry about your kids constantly. Are they eating enough? Are they warm enough? Did that cough sound a little off? It's exhausting, honestly, and it never really stops. Now imagine carrying that same worry with none of the tools you currently rely on. No pediatrician, no vaccines, no car seat, no safe crib in a locked, climate-controlled room. And here's the part that reframes everything. Your ancestors weren't careless about this. They built an entire, sophisticated system around exactly this problem, and pieces of it are still shaping how you parent today, whether you realize it or not. Picture early human groups moving across the landscape, hunting, gathering, constantly exposed to weather, predators, and disease with almost none of the medical safety nets you take for granted. Childhood, in that world, carried genuinely brutal risk. Historians and demographers who study pre-modern populations estimate that in many ancient and pre-industrial societies, a substantial share of children didn't survive to adulthood. That number sounds shocking today, and it should. But the instinct to read it as evidence that ancient parents cared less or invested less emotionally in their children turns out to be almost exactly backward. So if the danger was constant, what was the actual strategy? The answer starts with a single, quietly radical idea. You don't raise a child alone. This is where anthropologist Hrdy's research becomes essential to understanding what was actually happening. Hrdy has spent decades studying a pattern she calls cooperative breeding, or alloparenting, the practice of child rearing distributed across an entire group rather than resting on one or two parents. Her research argues that humans are, evolutionarily, unusual among great apes, precisely because of this. Chimpanzee mothers carry, feed, and protect their infants almost entirely alone. Human infants, by contrast, are typically held, fed, watched, and comforted by grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated group members, sometimes within hours of birth. Think about what that actually means for survival odds. A single exhausted parent has one set of eyes, a group has dozens. A single caregiver has to sleep eventually. A group, distributed across many adults and older children, effectively never fully stops watching. Anthropologist Hewlett has documented this directly among the AKA people of Central Africa. One of several contemporary hunter-gatherer societies researchers study specifically because their childcare patterns likely resemble those of ancient human groups more closely than modern industrialized parenting does. Hewlett's research recorded infants among the AKA being held by someone almost continuously for the vast majority of daylight hours, passed fluidly between mothers, fathers, and a wide circle of other caregivers throughout the day. This wasn't occasional babysitting. It was a structural feature of daily life, baked into how the entire group organized itself. One detail from Hewlett's work stands out in particular. AKA fathers, in his observations, were involved in direct infant care at levels far exceeding what researchers had documented in almost any other society studied at the time, holding infants for a meaningful share of daylight hours themselves rather than treating childcare as work reserved for mothers alone. That finding mattered because it pushed back hard against a once common assumption in anthropology that fathers in small-scale societies were mostly hunters and providers, distant from the actual daily labor of keeping a child alive. The evidence instead pointed to something closer to a genuinely shared burden, spread wide enough that no single relationship and no single person's health or mood on a given day became a single point of failure for a child's well-being. Here's the detail that reframes the whole picture. This constant physical contact wasn't primarily about affection, though affection was clearly part of it. It was infrastructure. A body in constant contact with an infant regulates that infant's temperature, notices illness earlier, responds to distress within seconds instead of minutes, and makes accidental falls or predator encounters dramatically less likely. Warmth, safety, and nutrition, all delivered through the simple, unglamorous mechanism of near-constant proximity. So how did ancient parents handle the moments when direct holding wasn't possible? This is where archaeology adds a piece nobody expects. Archaeologists studying sites across Europe and Asia have recovered a surprisingly consistent tool across wildly different ancient cultures: the cradleboard, a rigid carrying frame that let a caregiver secure an infant safely while their hands were free to gather food, tend a fire, or travel. Some cradleboards recovered from colder climates show clear evidence of insulating linings, soft mosses and furs packed inside to trap warmth. Researcher and bioarchaeologist Mary Lewis, who studies childhood health and development in ancient skeletal remains, has found that cradleboard use left detectable, measurable marks on infant skull shape in some populations, physical evidence confirming just how widespread and consistent this practice actually was across generations. This is a genuinely important reframe. A cradleboard isn't primitive babysitting, it's engineering, purpose-built to solve the specific problem of keeping an infant secure, warm, and monitored while an adult's hands were occupied with the work survival demanded. Cradleboards also traveled easily, which mattered enormously for groups that moved seasonally in search of food. A caregiver could sling the entire board across their back, keep both hands free for climbing, carrying tools, or steadying themselves on difficult terrain, and still keep the infant close enough to sense every small shift in breathing or temperature. Some designs incorporated a slight forward tilt or a soft brace behind the head, head. Details bioarchaeologists like Mary Lewis have connected to deliberate support for developing spines and skulls, not just convenient containment. This was iterative, tested design, refined across generations of caregivers who had every incentive in the world to get the details right. Food posed its own distinct challenge, one modern parents rarely think about at all. Breast milk was, for the vast majority of human history, the only reliably safe infant food available, since unclean water or poorly prepared alternatives carried genuine serious risk. This is part of why Hrdy's cooperative breeding research also points to something called Allonursing, other lactating women in a group nursing a child who wasn't biologically theirs. If a mother fell ill or her own milk supply temporarily failed, the group itself functioned as a backup food source, distributed across multiple bodies instead of depending on any single one. Here's the twist that changes how you should read those grim historical mortality numbers. High child mortality didn't mean ancient parents were emotionally distant or resigned to loss as simply routine. Grave goods recovered from ancient infant and child burials across numerous cultures, small toys, carefully made miniature tools, decorative beads, deliberately placed alongside the body, tell a very different story. Archaeologists studying these burials consistently describe them as reflecting deep, genuine grief and careful ritual care, not casual indifference. The high numbers reflect a world with limited medical tools, not limited parental love. Some of the clearest evidence for this comes from sites where infants who died very young were still buried within or immediately beside the living spaces of the group, rather than in separate, distant burial grounds. Archaeologists interpret this pattern as deliberate, a choice to keep a lost child close, physically and symbolically, within the ongoing life of the family, rather than removed from it. That single detail complicates any easy assumption that high mortality bred emotional distance. If anything, it suggests the opposite, a society organizing its space and its rituals specifically around the reality that loss was common and building ways to hold and honor it, rather than push it aside. And this cooperative structure extended past infancy into how ancient children were actually raised day to day. Anthropological research on hunter-gatherer societies consistently finds that older children, sometimes only a few years older than the child they're minding, play an enormous active role in looking after younger siblings and group members. This wasn't neglect dressed up as tradition. It was a functioning, effective system, one that simultaneously freed adults for essential subsistence work and taught older children real caregiving skills they would carry directly into their own future parenting. Play itself, in these settings, doubled as training. Children in many documented hunter-gatherer societies practice skills like fire tending, food identification, and basic first aid on dolls, on each other, on younger siblings, folded seamlessly into games long before any of it becomes a serious responsibility. By the time a child was old enough to genuinely help care for an infant, they'd already spent years rehearsing exactly that role in miniature, low-stakes form. Nobody sat them down for a lesson. The entire social environment they grew up inside was, quietly, one long apprenticeship in keeping other people's children alive. Think about what all of this means for how you understand your own instincts as a parent today, even if you've never once thought about hunter-gatherer childcare. The overwhelming urge to hold a crying infant, the instinct to never really let a baby out of sight for long, the deep, culturally near-universal reliance on grandparents for childcare help. None of that is a modern invention. It's an inherited structure, refined over an almost unimaginable span of time, built by ancestors who understood, without any formal science to back it up, that a child's survival was never actually a one-person job. You worry about your kids constantly. Are they eating enough? Are they warm enough? Did that cough sound a little off? That worry, and the instinct to reach for help instead of carrying it entirely alone, is one of the oldest, most carefully engineered survival systems your species ever built. Your ancestors didn't have pediatricians or car seats. What they had, instead, was each other, and it turns out that was enough to carry humanity all the way to you.